Say hello. Okay, starting live. Let's see. All right, hello everyone. Welcome. Happy Wednesday to you. Looks like we've got about 30 people here in the YouTube stream. Hope everybody's having a great week. We're continuing our look at illustration and illustration techniques using Illustrator, using Photoshop. Today we're going to focus on sketching out very quickly 3 different illustrations and then taking that sketch, going into Adobe Illustrator, working with layers, working with gradients, working with texture to create an interesting illustration in there and talk about the tools along the way. So I've already gone ahead and set up 3 scenes here. And sometimes it's nice just for a quick view to inside of Photoshop. Let's see, window, arrange. I'm in the tile all horizontally, so you can see every document you have tiled up. So I think our theme for today is going to be technology, computers. Apologies for the image preview on the stream. We're not actually going to work on that scene, but the principles are the same nonetheless. So I've set up 3 scenes here that contain what we talked about in that first week, setting up a 2-point perspective grid to work against. And then just so you can see it clear, I added another line, and we'll just start in this one, to show where the horizon line is. And if you can tell, in each of these scenes, I have the horizon line in a different place. So as I sketch it out, it's an interesting way to think about what is going to be the coolest horizon line and perspective on our illustration that we can come up with. So it's kind of a fun way to play with where your horizon line is and where we're looking at the object. So in the first one, I have it right down the middle, have a super low horizon line and a super high horizon line. So let's just start on the first one, and I'm kind of thinking laptop. I'm thinking laptop, old computer monitor, and like an old car phone or cell phone. So let's just quickly block out what our laptop illustration could look like. And I'm just going to hold Shift to do it like that. And I'm going to kind of follow along this line. And for me, I really have to like butcher an illustration and be really rough with it, even on the Cintiq. So I'm following my rules of 2-point perspective. And one thing I really want to accentuate in each of these is like really blocky shapes with a lot of depth and dimension. Maybe that's a little too much. I want it to feel decently modern on this one. And that line needs to be tightened up. For me, it's really a process of putting down a lot of lines and then kind of erasing back and forming what is a good general shape. I'm just going to turn my Cintiq screen a little bit. Let's get a little bit of lines going this way. This will be like our keyboard coming out here. Again, following that same line. Doing something in this direction. And I'll put down a lot of really rough lines and make a bit of a mess of it before I can really start to see it. So it's getting a little pinched on the back side because I think the end of the computer is going to need to be there. Kind of along that line. So that would be kind of our general angle on the laptop, on the shot. We can add a little bit of kind of detailing, how that does that typically. Then our keyboard lines. going to be in that range. Let's start to turn that off and see what we're dealing with, and I can immediately see how bad my perspective is there. So that would be one approach. It's very pinched and kind of squashed, but it's kind of cool. That could be an interesting base to give us some illustration on. Let's start again, actually, here with our low horizon line. And I'm actually going to keep everything above the line for the front of it. I think I'm going to up my brush a little bit. And I want this one to feel more square, actually. That'll go there. Hit L for the lasso tool. Do a little deleting. So these old computers are very, very chunky, which is cool. And then they kind of have that rounded back thing that kind of sticks out. Yep, it's going to follow that line. And then maybe even we add in one more piece. And because it is above the horizon line, we actually would ever so slightly just be looking up at it. We are very close to the horizon line, so it makes it tough to squeeze in the art, but when we get into Illustrator, it's a lot easier. Just clean this up very quickly. See what kind of shapes we've got here. Maybe we need to keep that one a little shorter. So I think those side panels are like so. Something like that. Something like that. Some kind of old school stand, maybe. That would probably be a little bit blocky itself. So maybe we are going to see a couple sides to that. I also think it's interesting to like just quickly define a light source and then think about the shadow, which would be running this way. But we would no longer see the shadow after the horizon line. So that one would have a really, really compressed shadow, but it would also tell us that like this panel is going to be lighter and these colors will be darker. So sometimes it's just nice to think about that in advance a little bit. And it's so tight to the horizon line, but we would be looking up at the bottom of it just a little bit. Sort of that. We'd be doing that number, that kind of thing. And that's kind of cool. I think that could be an interesting base. There's like a lot of chunkiness to the shapes that are happening there, which is nice. Let's quickly do our, you can see I was working on it a little bit here earlier. Let's just start fresh though. The kind of car phone design. And a high horizon line can be interesting. Let's just start by kind of drawing a box essentially in this space to think about the overall dimensions of it. And let's cut it off a little bit more like that. Hit L for the lasso tool. And this is below the horizon line, so we're seeing the top of it. And I'll just continue to follow my lines. And this kind of, let's put the antenna up above the horizon line, round it off a little bit, add a little detailing. Now it's nice just to draw a box first, because then we could say, well, it isn't a perfect box. It has this kind of indent and then comes back. And then we can just kind of cut out that line and do it on the same, kind of the same thing on the other side. And I do want these, Command D to deselect, to be up and down. So here would be like a keypad situation we could block in. Maybe we would see a little bit of a crease there. Or maybe it's this kind of thing, this kind of detail. And let's undo that line. Maybe just the phone has some little, you know, like those plastic phones that have kind of indents and things like that. We could also work on rounding off some of the corners. Felt like a lot of the stuff in the 80s, 90s was like a lot of rounded plastic. And here we could say the light will be on this side, so these faces will be the brightest. And we can get a much longer shadow in this shot. And we see that if it's coming from this direction, it needs to fall. It needs to fall in line with these lines heading back to this point. And there's kind of that piece. And lightens up a little bit. So there's that one. So this gives you a sense of the middle horizon line, the low horizon line where you're looking up at something. It's very epic and presented. And then the very high horizon line where we're actually looking down on things, which creates a ton of ground plane. And we can kind of already see if a shadow is going to be an interesting part of this, then looking down on the object and seeing all that ground plane is probably a really, probably like a better approach. I think of the three, maybe the old phone is my favorite that we could execute on. Let's see. Just check in on the stream here. Lindsay, hello, what's up? Scott, hello, how you doing? Southern Shoddy, hello. So you guys tell me which of these three should we go execute inside of Illustrator now? My vote would be for this one here. I think that's an interesting one. Maybe we could more define, you know, maybe if the light source is doing this thing over here, we could actually do some pretty cool shadowing on this shot too, where it's kind of like pulling towards the camera a little bit. I'm really digging this one though. Let's see if we get any feedback. I'm just going to make the executive decision to go ahead and work on this one here. So a couple of things we can do now is actually just go ahead and export. I'm going to turn these off. Actually, I'm going to leave those on. And I'm just going to go ahead and save that as a JPEG to my desktop. Let's jump into Illustrator. We will go ahead and I'll just drag and drop it from Finder. Go ahead and grab that sketch. Put it in here inside of my layers. I'll just go ahead and lower its opacity a bit. And we can just go ahead and lock that entire layer, start a new layer. And the first thing we'll do is grab the pen tool and just start blocking this in. And I'm actually going to swap it to stroke so it's not obstructing my view as I work on it. So we'll get that face. we'll get the top, which is going to need some work. The great thing about this now, though, is like I can still see my guides, and being able to nudge points around really allows me to actually clean up all my incorrect perspective. And so like this line needs to be flowing with these lines, and it's not quite. So I'm going to hit P for the pen tool, just keep going. I'm going to keep those pretty hard for now. I'm not going to actually round those corners out just yet. And for this part, it's going to be kind of a base, and I'm going to tuck it under the other ones. So I'll just do that number and put it on the bottom. And for the middle piece, I'm just going to flip the gradient. I can start to see it taking shape. And I think we should try to do like a cool, like just an interesting art direction kind of treatment of this. And I actually kind of want to move where the antenna is. I don't think that's quite right. And make it a little bit fatter, perhaps. And for this, I'm going to add a gradient that is much darker, because in my mind, that's kind of how that might look. I'm going to round off the top, so we get that. For the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and convert to Bezier points there, and get a little bit of a rounding effect on that base. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it'll make it feel a little bit better, but it needs to be way tighter than that. So we can kind of turn this off. I'm going to hit the pen tool again. I want to get my shadow established in the scene. I'll use my rough drawing here to set that in. And we'll even create that part of it. For now, let's just take that way down to something like 25%. Stick it on the bottom. I'll turn on the other layers. At this point, I think we can turn off that image and start to add some details and create more of a treatment here. The gradient, let's have some fun with the colors, actually, and say that we'll create kind of a psych environment. I'm going to keep everything really light on the phone, but the background will be our opportunity to, create like a really pretty background for this. And I can see this guy just needs to come up a little bit and meet that. Sometimes you really got to zoom in with Illustrator. So if the light source is coming from this way, the first thing we can establish and say, okay, this side needs to be brighter than the front face. So I'll grab the front face, and with my swatches, I'm going to stick with a gradient for now and just want to make it a little bit darker and see what that gives me. Right, so now it feels like I'm selling the effect a little bit more. Now on the top, the brightest edge should be here and the darkest edge should be there. So I'm actually just going to flip the gradient, and I'm going to grab a little bit of a darker color for the dark side of the gradient. And sometimes you just got to play with the angle if it's not like a perfectly flat 30 degrees. -30. So actually, this is where we could do a freeform gradient. And let's see, I don't need this many points on the freeform. I really just want 2 points. So I can define the back edge as a little bit darker. Do that kind of number. Looks all right. It's getting a little bit dark though, isn't it? Edit gradient, select that point, go over to my swatches, Just select a little bit of a lighter point. Actually, I'm just going to go back to a linear gradient and choose a black to white. This is frustrating me a little bit. Sorry, everybody. Really should be easier to find negative 60 degrees, negative 90 degrees. There we go. That's kind of what I'm looking for. And then I'll use a lighter color and make sure it's not too much. So for this one, again, we need to find, I kind of just want to sell the effect of it getting darker as it moves to the left. So we need a little bit more contrast on this gradient so I can see the difference. So if we say 0, that's just going to be left to right. That's kind of what we're looking for. So I like that. I think what we could do is, without making it feel super broken up, just establish that there are, you know, there's going to be a little bit of a difference. Sometimes that's as easy as swapping out gradients. I need to put that on the oops. Sorry. I built that into an existing one. I'm going to lock that down and then come in here. Yeah, just do our best to get kind of a subtle effect. And I can see that my points are not perfect in perspective. That's okay. We can always adjust. Oops. By pulling this up a little bit to match the angle we have on the other side. And before we move on, want there to just be the slightest feeling of that kind of separation, even if it's really tight, just getting a little bit of that effect in there. Let's try to add a little bit of texture while we're here, and I'll quickly fix the shadow a little bit. Let me lock the background. On the shadow, I want to go to my Pathfinder and actually just make that into a single shape. So I have one shape. And then I actually do want to apply a gradient to this guy so that it starts to fade a little bit out. So let me take the angle to 0. Need to flip it where we feel the shadow fading a little bit. And the shadow feels a little small, so I think maybe we try to bulk it up a little bit. We may have to do some adjusting. Actually, what we'll do is we'll just tell the gradient we don't want it to fade until kind of the very end. So I'm going to take this side panel. I'm going to hit Command-C, Command-F to copy and paste it in place. Then I'm going to go to Effect, Pixelize, and we talked about this before, adding a color halftone into it. And I'm going to dramatically simplify what's going on here. And go ahead and add a halftone pattern into the side there. Then we're going to need to choose some modes here. I think we want to say multiply to get rid of the white. And it might be cool to actually stagger it off the body of the design a little bit. I think that's kind of cool. The next thing we'll do is try to give a little bit more detail to the illustration. So one thing I'll do is just grab the line tool, give that a black stroke, and need to make sure it's actually black, and that's a little too thick. So we'll do that, Command C, Command F, then I'll tap it down a little bit. I think that's a nice little detail. I think another detail we could add is make it look like there's kind of a little rubber guard or something. And I'll go to my stroke tools, grab the stroke panel and round those corners off and see how that looks. Not terrible, not great. Maybe we need to just make it feel a little tighter to the edge. Kind of okay. So I think really the fun thing here would be to try to find a cool solution for the buttons. Or let's actually start with kind of the lines you would see where the actual audio reception comes through. Oh, come on. I'm actually going to make a new layer. Close the Pathfinder, close my gradient, close my brushes for now. There we go. So yeah, that's going to be too much, but we can probably do a much more subtle approach where it feels just a little indented. Oh, come on now. And I think it's fun to be a little bit imperfect and just kind of eyeball it. It's going to have a feel of something that's definitely not super realistic, which I think is cool. So this corner kind of needs to drop down a little bit so that it's a little more flat across. I think this corner needs to drop down a little bit as well. This one needs to kind of match that angle, so it needs to go up a little bit. We'll do a similar thing across the bottom. I want these blockier gray shapes. And we'll add a third one for good measure. So I think we're getting close. I think it's kind of interesting. I'm going to duplicate my shadow and again ask for it to render a halftone. So I need to put that away. And we'll say multiply, we'll say screen. And we'll take the opacity down quite a bit. I think just adding a little bit of texture into that makes it feel a little bit better. I'm going to grab the rectangle tool and try to figure out maybe like a cool solution for our buttons here. So this will be kind of the keypad where it lives. It should probably sit up decently close to the edge. And you can always use your alignment tools to align individual points, which is useful. So that actually shows me how these points could use a little alignment adjust there. And in terms of the gradient, just do that for now, just so we can see the difference. And so this line and this line should feel parallel. To try to keep to our 2 point, this line and this line should feel parallel as well. I think we're getting to an interesting place here. Maggie, we can talk about the grids again. We did the grid demo, Maggie, a couple weeks back in Photoshop using the polygon tool and turning it into a star, which is a really great, quick, easy way to do that. Let's go ahead and try to almost like cut lines in here so we can try to make buttons. Yeah, maybe just like a faint gray. So one other thing we can do actually is, probably don't want to go that crazy. We can even make this feel, you know, part of the blockiness of the scene here. Make it feel like it sticks out a little bit. That line would be going that way. That line would be going back that direction. So actually use white to try to cut into this. So my theory on the buttons is we just create a big block. And so the bottom row, we're going to have to adjust these lines to try to keep our perspective going. And they're not all exactly the same size, so let's try to just match it up a little better. Then we can kind of do this number where we try to cut back in to really give the sense that there's some actual buttons here, like a little keypad that's sticking out. And we need to be following those lines. And then I think the last one is just vertical. And as you can see, I'm quite terrible eyeballing the distance. So it's not a terrible solution. It's kind of cool. This edge needs to probably be more respecting our light source. So we might need to just lighten that edge up a little bit. And I accidentally added a stroke that I will kill there. So that's a little better in keeping with our scene. This guy's gradient needs to flip because, again, we've got the light coming from this direction. So we're trying to keep it decently consistent there. And we can do a little cleanup on our buttons. One thing we can do is select the 4 vertical lines. And again, use our alignment tools to evenly distribute that. And that definitely cleans it up a little bit. That line needs to be going more this direction. I think they all do, actually. So we're getting a pretty cool look, actually. I kind of like where we're headed. I think one thing we can do is come to this side piece hit Command C, Command F. I'm going to flip it to the stroke, and I'm going to choose a dark stroke. And I want to add almost like those small dents that you would see, like maybe if this this piece of plastic was separate. So I just want to get it really faint. I obviously don't need the back line. I really just want this up and down line. So let's see. And we're getting a weird look with the gradient. I think I'd actually just prefer to work with it as a solid color that isn't quite so dark, because it should feel pretty subtle, like a subtle detail, something like that. That's actually quite what I'm thinking based on my sketch. Maybe we can push that out even further, just as the possible art direction. Line that up a little bit. So I kind of want to copy that style and then do that same kind of thing, almost like going to the back there. That I think is a cool detail. Go back to the line tool. Similar kind of thing. I think you'd see that most likely. Kind of cool. Maybe these pieces get 2 pixels just to do a little bit more variation. And this I want to exist underneath. I guess we just need to bring that to the top. Bring the halftone pattern onto the top. I mean, it's definitely cool without the halftone. I just think it's good to play. It's good to play with textures, and it's maybe something you kill in the final. So the shadow, that line's going to bother me. Let's turn off the shadow texture, because it definitely needs to be right on that edge. We could grab our shape tool, put it at the very bottom. Do a radial gradient, flip it. We're going to have to really play with this. Let's just do a linear gradient, actually. And just add a little bit of contact shadow. And for all you 3D users, you know global illumination and ambient occlusion. The things, as surfaces get closer together, they cast a shadow. And it can maybe feel a little bit more realistic to have that kind of multiple shadow overlap because light bounces. So I think it's possible to maybe even play with something in that realm where you get that kind of double shadowing because light is bouncing and its shadows are rarely perfect. Feels a little bright on the black end of the gradient, so I think we could, well, I think we just need to take the opacity down a little bit to blend it in. So there we have it. I think that's a pretty cool start. I'm going to hit Command Save after doing that for 20 minutes. And go back into Photoshop. And I want to go open that Illustrator scene. I want to bring it in as a photo. Come on now. No. Sorry, y'all. What am I doing wrong? File, open. I think actually what I'm doing wrong is the file export as Photoshop file. Say to export it as a Photoshop file. Yeah. I have a bunch of other phone illustrations. Maximum editability, right layers, yes, yes, thank you. It'll create a Photoshop file for us. Sorry about that. File, open. Open this Photoshop file. Full screen it. And what we get is some of our layers here, where we can create some clipping masks and play with some brushes and see about other types of texturing. Look at some dry media brushes, or even a paintbrush kind of thing. That's a little rough. What I really want is more of just kind of a speckle airbrush. So yeah, we could add a little bit of kind of rough texture on there, almost like it's been used or handled at some point. It's got little imperfections. And I think we could go heavy and then maybe pull it back quite a bit. And I think I like it everywhere, but I don't like it on the buttons. I think we can keep those kind of clean. Got our shadow layers. We can create a clipping mask on the shadow. Maybe grab a black speckled brush. I think it's going to be way too faint. Just because that layer's opacity is already kind of low, but you can see we can add a little bit of grit into it. We can go to our other one, add a layer, our other shadow. Do kind of a similar thing where we just put a little bit of noise into it. We've got that layer. And I'm just going to color pick this guy. Create a little bit of roughness. Maybe we need to go a little darker. And just add a little bit of noise. I'll keep it off of that piece, but do kind of that number. Create a little imperfection in there. And we're keeping it pretty subtle. This is overall a pretty clean design. But that would be my process for something like this. Starting with the sketch phase, looking at the horizon line, laying out the grid, thinking about the shape, quick sketches into Adobe Illustrator, create your artwork, figure out your colors, And if you are going to add even more rasterized pixel-based texturing, then exporting it as a Photoshop file, bringing it in here, adding any little touches that you want to add. But overall, I think that's kind of a cool little illustration that we did, and hopefully there's some good workflow and process stuff in there for you. Yeah, Maggie, thanks for tuning in. If there's any questions, I can hang out for a minute and we can talk about it. But hopefully this was another helpful session in this series where we're talking about Photoshop and Illustrator. And I know for me it was more important actually to learn proper perspective drawing and learn about light and shadows. And then, the software then just becomes a tool to execute what is a good idea or a bad idea, right? A good illustration or a bad illustration. But Illustrator is just such an incredible tool to work with gradients and work with perfect vector art that can scale, and you can be extremely precise. So for me, when I'm doing client work, it's a lot like this. I do a lot of Illustrator-based stuff. I typically am not going to throw a lot of Photoshop texturing into it, just because when it comes to animation, it can kind of simplify what you're actually working with on your files. Tiana, hello, thank you. She's giving us the fire emoji. That's a good sign, I think. So yeah, I'm thinking for next week, we could talk a little bit about more environmental painting, go back and focus on Photoshop and do more environmental painting and talk about the ways to create the appearance of atmosphere and create light, and think about the way that all those studios like the Giant Ants and the Bucks that do a lot of narrative driven work, and they're creating environments and doing that kind of visual development. I think there's some really good basic go-to things you can do to give the appearance of depth and environment and atmosphere, and the way that atmosphere kind of washes over objects in an environment. So that'll be next Wednesday. We'll talk about that. Hopefully you can tune in. And as always, everything is going to be living here on our YouTube channel. I don't see any questions in the stream, so I will just say everybody have an amazing Wednesday. Thank you so much for hanging out. Check out mographmentor.com if you want to learn more about Mograph Mentor. We're in our summer semester right now. Our Class 1 students are really now starting to dive into tackling their visual essay, so I know they're going to be spending a lot of time sketching, designing, illustrating, animating. So it should be a great semester. Everybody, thank you so much. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time.